Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
I'll introduce it because political card is still having his snack.
You're taking responsibility.
We'll get started to make sure that the last speaker will have enough time to deliver his presentation before time's up for the conference. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor Kim Soon-moon, who is a good friend of mine, a very distinguished scholar of Confucian philosophy. And today we are very privileged to be able to hear his presentation on a very important topic, classical Chinese philosophy in the time of the Warring States, early Confucians, Mencius, and Sun Tzu. So Professor Kim is from the City University of Hong Kong, and he has recently spoken at conferences at our university.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for both Tony and Jan inviting me to this interesting conference. And some of you might wonder, well, you know, I've been waiting for 2 days. I mean, I've been here 2 days just for this. I mean, to conclude this conference. I'm a little bit embarrassed to give this final presentation for this great workshop. But and also my approach is I'm political theorist trained in political science. I'm not historian and I'm not legal scholar. So my approach is not historical, and it's far more analytical. So the way I approach the text would be a little bit different from the way the other presenters dealt with text and history. So please bear with me. So if you bear with me for roughly 50 minutes, then everything's going to be fine. And definitely I'll end before the dinner time, 6:30. So. Okay, the title of my talk is The Politics of Extended Responsibility, Confucian Virtue Politics, or Dazi, in the World of Warring States. So this is my core argument. Okay, warring states Confucians such as Mencius and Sun Tzu were able to meet both the political and philosophical challenges that the collapse of Zhou dynasty's universal moral political authority gave rise to with regard to morality of war and legitimate interstate relations on the one hand, and their global vision of virtue politics on the other, by justifying a virtuous ruler's punitive expedition or even annexation of a tyrannical state through creative reappropriations of core stipulations of Confucian virtue politics centered around the ruler's care and moral and political responsibility for the people in a way relevant to the new interstate context in which there is no visible political institution representative of the mandate of heaven upon which Zhou's universal kingship was predicated. So it's a long statement, but basically my argument is something like this. As we studied this whole day, the Chinese political imagination was basically predicated on this idea of mandate of heaven and universal kingship. Okay, so when Confucian tradition doesn't represent the whole Chinese tradition, of course, but Confucianism was on the mainstay of especially Chinese political, not only Chinese but also East Asian political theory. Confucius was trying to rejuvenate with a certain modification this Zhou civilization. So on the one hand, he looked conservative in this regard, but on the other hand, he transvaluated the meaning of Dao, which was potent or power, into moral virtue, as we are familiar with. So he did a lot of transformation. I mean, he did a lot of renovative works when it comes to this basic conception ideas, but then still, the ideal civilization for Confucius was Zhou dynasty. So, you know, he was maneuvering himself in this global context. Still, Zhou is global, Zhou king is global universal king, and the word that he's addressing to was so-called war on the heaven, the Tianxia. So he was not thinking about any particular individual ruler here in this warring Chunchu or warring state, the Zhongguo states. Actually, he was projecting on one universal ruler. So his virtue ethics and virtue politics was basically revolving around one universal ruler. But then later, Confucius was living, his state of life was 551 to 549 BCE, and then 150 years later, the Mengzi, the second greatest Confucian, came out, and then the time has drastically changed because now Zhou still existed. Zhou dynasty still existed, but only in name, just very small state, and all the other feudal states, mainly 7 feudal states, has become so powerful so that they are virtually independent and sovereign. Again, here the concept of sovereignty is a little tricky because it has nothing to do with Schmittian, political theology, but still, de facto, they are independent and sovereign states. And then Zhou dynasty, the universal kingship, was really, really shrunken so that they were just smaller than any other fiefdom, feudal states. So it was basically virtually they are non-existent, although legally they were there until 245 BCE. So Mencius was basically living and maneuvering as a philosopher in this new, utterly great, dramatically changed the world, where virtually independent states were vying for supremacy to reunify the world. And then later, 221, Jin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Jin dynasty, Jin empire. That's why we have the first empire created. This guy from Jin dynasty, Jin state, reunified the empire and called himself Huangdi, and we translate, Chinese people translate it into emperor. Okay, so back then it was king. Again, I'll explain these terms again, but back then it was just Zhou king. King having nothing to do with this kings in European context. King was a universal sovereign, universal ruler, and universal ruler was called king, and his official title was Tenzi, the son of heaven, but his formal title was king. King was so the privilege for the Zhou rulers, actually, universal king. But then this later 221, when this fiefdom was, the feudal world was completely abolished, and then this Jin emperor, Jin king actually reunified the world. He declared himself as an emperor. And then Sunji, the third philosopher in Confucian, I mean, he's arguably a rival of Mengzi because of their drastically different views of human nature. Mengzi was very famous for his notion of Shengxian, human nature is good, and then Sunji said human nature is bad, and they are proposing very different versions of human nature and accordingly moral theories of moral cultivation. So in the Confucian tradition, we have Confucius, kind of Socrates, and then we have Mengzi, Plato, and then we have Sunji, Aristotle. So the debate between Mengzi and Sunji is kind of, it's very similar in terms of structure between the debate between Aristotle and Plato and Aristotle. So Sunji was born 60 years, about 2 generations later, Mengzi. So and then Sunji was very close to the end of this complete feudal world and then beginning of the empire. So both Mengzi and Sunji were living in a dramatically different world, even if they were yearning for this Zhou, civilization, just like Confucius. But then the context was so different, so that they had to come up with a different political theory to, in a way that makes sense in the context of a Confucius idea, but also applicable in this dramatically changed new political context. So that's kind of my argument. How Sunji or Mencius were recreating Confucian virtue politics, which was advanced in the context of universal kingship in the world where there is no universal king at all. Okay, so Confucian virtue politics, or rule of virtue, has 2 stipulations. First, it is primarily the ruler's moral virtue, which he acquires. So it's still there is the pronunciation same, the etymology same. So the original the is what someone acquires. It's a power, what someone acquires. But then later, especially Confucius reinterpreted it in terms of moral, inner force, moral virtue. Okay? From heaven, by virtue of his strenuous moral self-cultivation that makes politics virtuous. Again, by virtue of, it's not real by virtue of, it's more functioning term, but then there is kind of interplay of the language here, but the king, the ruler, acquires this power, which is virtue, from heaven, and then he's spreading this virtue on the people. That's one stipulation. So in the early Confucian moral political imagination, the ruler was conceived as the son of heaven, presiding over all under heaven, and he was believed to be granted with the heaven's beneficence. And his mission was to pass it on to the people that he governs by being virtuous. Okay. So second stipulation is this. While struggling with making contemporary rulers who generally ascended the throne by hereditary right, sage kings, universal ruler, who is perfectly virtuous, early Confucians also emphasized that the central purpose of Confucian virtue politics lies in making the people morally elevated by leading and educating them by means of rituals, the moral and political institutions and practices established by former sage kings. So not only kings should rule, acquire the power, the virtue from heaven and spread it to the people, he has to make the people almost equally virtuous. That was two stipulations of Confucian virtue politics. King should be virtuous on the one hand, and he's got to make the people virtuous on the other hand. So that's the core stipulation, the underpinning of Confucian and purpose of Confucian politics. So Confucians were strongly convinced that good government is possible only if politics is predicated on moral virtue of both the ruler and the ruled. While the ruler's stellar moral character inspires the people toward moral goodness, the morally elevated people underpin his government not for mere instrumental reasons, but sincerely from their heart. So one talks about moral leadership, and the second part talks about moral legitimacy. It's not just only about ruler being virtuous, leading the people, but also people should underpin the whole regime voluntarily and by virtue of their own virtue. So therefore, the two stipulations of Confucian virtue politics were concerned with moral leadership and moral legitimacy, which combined to make a government that is of global scale. We're talking about global governance, in principle, a good government. And that was the goal of Confucius, to make Zhou king the power and to make any king, universal king, virtuous so that we can maintain kind of Zhou universal ritual civilization. Ironically, however, early Confucians developed this global version of virtue politics focused on all under heaven in the midst of arguably the most turbulent period in Chinese history called the Warring Stage period, the Zhongguo period. So this idea, the Mencius and Sunji inherited from Confucius, but then they had to implement this idea in one of the most turbulent periods in Chinese history. So that was challenging for them. So the questions arise. How did the early Confucians, particularly Mencius, 3rd, 4th century BC, and Sunji, accommodate their global vision of virtue politics that they inherited from Confucius to a drastically altered political situation during the Warring Stage period, which apparently was favorable to neither virtue politics nor global political philosophy for universal kingdom. So basically, this was a period of realpolitik, and then these people were trying to convince the warring rulers of Confucian virtue politics, but how? That was their challenge. How could they make their global political theory relevant for feudal laws, rulers of an ancient political entity called Guo, whose primary concern was to enrich their own state and strengthen their own military, which was the key political motto of all states at the time, rather than benefit all under the heaven. So back then, again, it was time of a period of realpolitik, and each feudal state, again, not only nominally feudal, but really de facto independent and sovereign state, Guo. Again, whether these states are the kind of states that we are familiar with, the nation states, very different. But again, I mean, so that's why Chinese call these states Guo. But these states were, again, trying to overcome the current situation, and each ruler of this state was trying to become a new emperor, new ruler, universal ruler. Okay, but then they were basically concerned with enriching and empowering their own individual state. So in that context, how can we, Confucians, convince these people care about benefit the people all under heaven? In short, how could the early Confucians make their political theory of virtue politics relevant in the interstate context without compromising their theories' global vision? Okay, so I don't use international because national, there's no national state, so I use interstate instead. So now Confucius, just briefly, Although Confucius was deeply worried about the emerging new world order marked by unruly interstate situations and interstate relations, his most eminent concern was how to restore the Zhou civilization by keeping the feudal laws in their right places, ritually ordered places. So for Confucius, the sovereign authority of the still feudal state did not in itself create an independent philosophical question as long as a Zhou court entertained its traditional moral authority and its ritual culture, which he called this culture of ours, Xiuan, only to be reinvigorated. So when Confucius was alive, still Zhou court was still extant and still entertaining certain power and authority. And then we call this period the Chunchu spring and autumn period. When Zhou completely lost its political power and moral authority, and then we say this is the beginning of the Zhongguo period, the warring stage period. So Confucius' view was still Zhou court has waned and has lost its substantively its power, but then still Zhou court is here, and all we want to do is to rejuvenate this authority by reinventing all these rituals and others. But then still here, it's focusing on this universal rulership. Mencius and Sunji, however, belong to quite different world. The Zhou court's moral authority as the king was no longer respected by the feudal, now de facto independent states, and several powerful rulers pursued to become the king themselves, the ruler of the unified or reunified world, while most of the feudal lords were struggling for mere survival. Now, going back to Christopher's question, again, king was a title only for the son of heaven, the universal king, Zhou king, okay, king. Emperor or empire was not the part of Chinese lexicon until that time. And then now, during the Zhongguo period, the warring stage period, each powerful feudal lord was employing this title of a king. They basically de facto declaring themselves as a king. You know, Zhou has waned, Zhou is almost non-existent. I'm the king. So they call themselves the king. So when you open the Mencius, you know, the Mencius starts with his Mencius conversation. King Hui of Liang. Liang is one of the feudal stage here. But then the king himself called the ruler of the state. He's actually duke, but called himself a king because he wants to become universal king, just like a Zhou king. Again, the title of emperor was an invention of Jin Huangdi, the first emperor of Jin dynasty in 221. So we're talking about very different things. And then once the Zhongguo warring stage rulers were adopting this title of king, every ruler was using this title of king for them, hoping to become universal king. And then later, this title of king was universally employed by feudal lords, even after the creation of empire. So even Korean king, Korea was introduced this tributary system later, of course, way later. But then the Korean king was called king because by following this kind of later practice, not the original practice. Again, the king was only Chinese universal king. Okay, and then king has this privilege to communicate with heaven, Tian. So when Koreans created a emperorship in 1897, the meaning was that now Korean king can directly communicate with the heaven. And then they created this altar where the king make a direct sacrificial ritual to heaven. Previously, Korean king was prevented from making sacrificial ritual to heaven. It was only the son of heaven's privilege, the Chinese emperor's privilege in later dynasty, Han dynasty and Tang dynasty. The immediate challenge posed to them then was how to accommodate Confucius' original political thought focused on a general and global theory of world politics to the contemporary reality of interstate relations, unconstrained by any transcendental moral political authority which could arbitrate the class of interest among the feudal states. How can heaven's beneficence, which in principle can only be passed to all under heaven in mediation of kings, again, a son of heaven's brilliant moral virtue, be reached to all people in the world when the world is now divided into independent states? Okay? How can we realize this whole discourse in a very different political situation? Now, Mencius, this is the first dialogue between Mencius and King Hui of Liang in the first chapter of Mencius, the book of Mencius. Basically, King Hui asks again, he's one of the feudal lords, but asks that, how can I enrich my state? Why even if I do my best to attract the people and serve to benefit the people, why people don't come to my state? Okay, that was his question. And Mengsho's answer is basically, I'm not going to read this. Mengsho's answer, okay, and then King he thinks that he benefited his people, and he now wants Mengsho to tell him how to profit his state. I'm doing good thing to my people, then how can I profit my state? Okay, this is basically his focus on his people and his state. And then what is interesting is that Mengsho's advice to the king was focused not merely on how to profit his state or his people, but how to benefit the people of the world. In other words, by encouraging the king to exercise the kingly Wang Dao, it's the statecraft exercised by former sage kings. So it's kind of ideal statecraft. So universal moral statecraft intended for all under heaven, Mengsho shifts the king's attention from his own state to the people in general. Okay? So while adhering to Confucian's global vision of virtue politics, at the core of which universal kingship, Mengsho was realistic enough not to dismiss as completely illegitimate the new reality of interstate relations, in which states are not only independent, but have different sizes according to power due to deviance from Zhou ritual order. Confucius blamed, when Confucius alive, Confucius blamed the feudal lords for usurping these rituals, the kingly rituals, the preserved for the Zhou kings. But now, Mengsho, even if he was an ardent follower of Confucian way, was not criticizing these feudal rulers for usurping this title of a king or ingratiating themselves with these kingly rituals. Rather, he wanted to shift their attention from their own so-called national state interest to the benefit welfare of the all under the heaven. So for Mengsho, the most practically effective way to achieve this middle way was to make the incumbent rulers, otherwise preoccupied with the power and wealth of their own states, feel responsible for the welfare of the people of another state and ultimately all people under heaven, and to care for them without encouraging them to pursue the position or the title of universal kingship. So he didn't encourage people, the king, to become universal kingship. Of course, Mengsho wanted kings like He of Liang or King Shen of Qi, his interlocutors, political interlocutors, to become universal king. But he didn't really strongly encourage them to do so. Unlike his own teacher Confucius, he understood, he accepted the reality of warring states. In the states are now, the world is divided into these states, and what he mainly was concerned about was how to make individual king to be concerned with and careful the people, not only of their own people, but also people outside their own narrow state territory. Now, consider Mengsho's following description of a legendary sage king was punitive expedition of people of the Shang dynasty. Sage King Wu was a founder, actually co-founder of Zhou dynasty with his father. But now Mengsho describes King Wu's success like this. When King Wu marched on Yin, which is the capital city of Shang dynasty, he had only 300 war chariots and 300 brave warriors, a very small number of chariots and warriors. And he said, "Don't be afraid, I come to bring you peace, not to wage a war on the people." And the sound of people knocking their heads on the ground was like the toppling of a mountain. To wage a punitive war, zheng, is to rectify. So basically, the people welcomed, the Shang people welcomed King Wu's punitive expedition of their own state. Why? Because King Wu was a virtuous guy, and then the current incumbent ruler of Shang dynasty was a tyrant, and the people were so happy to embrace this so-called conqueror. And then Mengsho said to wage a punitive war by a virtuous ruler, virtuous guy to tyrant is to rectify the wrongness of this tyrant. So zheng is punitive war. Zheng is punitive war, and zheng rectifying again, it's pronounced the same. And here, Mencius is using the Chinese pronunciation to refer to different things. But actually, the reason is that previously Confucius defined the politics in terms of the second zheng, rectification of wrongness. So now what Mencius is implying here is that, well, Confucius defined the politics in terms of rectification. Now, punitive war, international, interstate relationship is also based upon this idea of rectification. So there is a continuum between domestic politics and international, interstate relationship. So in Mencius' narrative, King Wu initiated a war against King Zhou, the last emperor of Shang Dynasty, because of his extended sense of responsibility for the welfare of the In people who had long suffered from Zhou's tyranny. And it is this very sense of the sense that King Hui, his current interlocutor, or any other warring state ruler in his time lacked. Okay? Not only caring for his own people, but caring for the people who are suffering from tyranny outside his own territory. So Mencius calls the punitive war against the tyrant, and for the sake of the welfare of the people under the tyrant's rule, rectification, zheng. Same, that's the word Confucius employed to define politics. So by defining punitive war in terms of rectification, zheng, then Mencius shows that inextricable intertwinement between domestic politics, zheng, and interstate politics, zheng, punitive war in this case, with the overall framework of Confucian virtue politics. So he's embracing original Confucian lexicon here, idea here, and apply it to different contexts. Put differently, from the perspective of Mencius' idea of Confucian virtue politics, in the absence of a universal rulership, again, we don't have joking here. The task of a government does not end with securing the welfare of the people within the state, but extends to welfare of the people of other, especially neighboring states. Okay? So there's no joking, there's no universal king. How can we care about the other people outside the territory, our own territory, my own territory, is to extend our responsibility, our care to the people who are residing in our main neighboring states. I'm going to skip Sunji for the sake of time. Okay, so just briefly. Sunji has a similar idea, even if Sunji and markedly different from Mencius when it comes to his understanding of human nature and theory of moral cultivation. Briefly, Mencius argues because a human being is good in terms of possession of this inherent potential, the goodness. So only if we develop this goodness within us, then we can become junji, gentleman, gentlewoman, gentleman in this case, and even sage. So his model of self-cultivation is called the developmental model. We just, like agriculture, we just help people inculcate, grow, develop their nascent moral potential, which is good moral potential, and make it fully brown. And Sunji's case is human nature is bad, so that we need to carve it, we need to reform it into and transform it into good things. Just like we carve this thing, from wood, we create this desk or chair. These things fundamentally undergo fundamental transformation. So we call that reformation model. So anyhow, they're very different in terms of moral psychology and moral theory and human nature. But then when it comes to political theory, they have a lot in common. So Sunji, following Mengzi in this case, would argue that if there was a universal king, in other words, Zhou king, tyrannical feudal rulers ranked below according to Zhou's ritual order would be rightly punished by him or his delegates, or the tianli, the heaven-appointed officer. And this is a true meaning of punitive expedition. So there is a hierarchy here, moral hierarchy here, and then the Zhou king, at the pinnacle of this hierarchy, has a right, privilege, directly punishing these wrongdoers or appointing his own delegate to conduct this punitive expedition. However, in the absence of Zhou's universal moral political authority, which has made Zhou's former feudal state politically independent and morally equal, and this punitive expedition by the superior of the inferior, impossible in principle, a new way to punish tyrannical rulers ought to be contrived. Okay, so there is no moral hierarchy at all. Now, the 7 or 8, the feudal states are independent and sovereign and equal politically, right? Because they were all used to be feudal states under this previous political arrangement. Now, who's going to punish whom? Because they are equal in terms of political power and moral authority. So that was, and Sunji and both Sunji and Mencius wanted to retain this discourse, this narrative of punishment. So how can we reproduce the idea of punishment where there is no moral hierarchy among the states? So according to Sunji, two conditions must be met for a state or alliance of state to justify or punish a tyrannical state. Number one, the state delivering the heavenly punishment must care for the people suffering from tyranny. And number two, there must be sufficient and active harm done by tyrant against whom the punitive expedition is to be launched. So I'm going to discuss it fully later, but here the focus is not on the heaven or heaven's mandate, but to the people, suffering of the people or welcoming of the people. So the focus is now shifting from the heaven or heaven's mandate or heaven's officer to the people, the suffering or welcoming of the people. But for more important than this condition is the rulers now acting as a heaven appointed officer, his extended sense of moral responsibility. But later, the meaning of heaven becomes a little bit attenuated, and then we see this emergence of people as one of perhaps the most important political category when it comes to Confucian virtue politics. So let me discuss about that dimension of this whole discourse. The ancient cases discussed earlier, such as Wu's expedition, involve the transfer of a mandate of heaven from tyrannical suzerains to virtuous feudal rulers who have launched a heaven-authorized punitive expedition on their political superiors, the nominal possessors of the mandate of heaven. In the warring stage period, however, what is at stake is not so much the transfer of a mandate of heaven from one universal king to another universal king, typically a former feudal lord, but the obligation and entitlement of an independent state, de facto sovereign, to interfere with another state that is morally equal in order to rescue the people from tyrannical rule. So no ruler can claim heaven's mandate to rule the world, and no state is entitled to punish others, however tyrannical they are, because the traditional moral hierarchy between superiors and inferiors is now completely obsolete. Okay? So it's not like one universal ruler is replaced by one universal ruler. One dynasty gone, new dynasty emerges. No. 7, 8 states here, then how can we punish the tyrannical states, right, in the absence of this universal moral hierarchy? The dissolution of the universal kingship means a collapse of the theory of a mandate of heaven, or the theory is arbitrary exploitations by ambitious feudal lords. I don't discuss this aspect, and in the absence of heaven's mandate or its agent, there is no basis upon which to call a particular military engagement righteous or just. I mean, if you use this Christian just war theory, how can we call certain military engagement just or righteous? Okay, that was a question. Ultimately, then, the challenge for warring stage Confucians such as Mencius and Sunji can be recapitulated as this: how can a state, presumably governed by a virtuous ruler, justifiably intervene with another state under tyranny, which is equal in moral status, in the virtual absence of an international institutional body representative of the mandate of heaven, and without necessarily aiming at universal kingship? Now, let's focus on one case. I'm leaving large part of my paper, and I'm just focusing on some skeletons of my ideas. So maybe there are some loopholes here, but then I hope that you maybe understand basically what I'm trying to say here. Okay, this is one case Mencius was discussing. So Shandong was a minister of Qi. Qi is one of the largest and powerful, one of the most powerful Zhenguo states. Again, we're talking about mainly seven powerful, the most powerful states in Zhenguo warring stage period, which was conquered and abolished by Jin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Jin dynasty in 221 BCE. So anyhow, Qi is one of the powerful states. This minister asked Mencius whether it would be justified for Qi, the state, to attack another state called Yan of a similar size, very big, of a similar size, a state of almost equal size and strength. Noting the illegitimate transmission of the throne of the ruler of Qi to his minister, Mencius replied in May. Okay, so Qi was suffering from illegitimate transmission of a throne. Okay, so actually, to make a long story short, Gigi is just minister, prime minister, and he was manipulating this idea of abdication. You know, according to original Confucian idea, if you're virtuous, then hereditary kingship shouldn't be institutionalized. If you're virtuous, then you rule the people. Then you pick up the virtuous person as the next king, and you abdicate your king power to this guy, and this guy reigns power and become next king, and then he gives his throne to another virtuous guy. We call it abdication, shenryang, or abdication. Okay, so ideally there should be no hereditary kingship, right? But then, so Gigi is basically using this narrative of saying that, oh, king, I mean, JK is ruler. You know, you are really virtuous king, and if you're really virtuous king, then you should abdicate rather than you know, give your throne to your son. You should abdicate your position to one of the ministers. And then this gullible, you know, ruler was deceived by his minister, and he actually abdicated his position to this guy himself, Gigi. And then this Gigi were very tyrannical, and it raised a lot of problems, a lot of questions. Anyhow, so that was context. So the royal transmission of the throne didn't involve the mandate of heaven. It was illegitimate, it was problematic. And then the way Gigi, the prime minister, who became ruler in Yan, ruled the state was tyrannical. So Mengsha's reply was, yeah, it may. Okay, it may. G may be allowed to punish Yan. Then G attacks, actually, takes this response as an approval, then attacks and annexes Yan. Okay, that's what happened historically. Then later, when asked if Mengsha, he indeed encouraged G to attack Yan, one of his disciples, students, asked, oh, teacher, did you really encourage G to attack and annex Yan? And Mengsha's reply is the following. No. When Shendong asked me whether Yan might be smitten, I answered him in May. They accordingly marked on Yan, and they had asked, and if he asked me who has a right to march on Yan, I would have answered, a heaven-appointed officer has a right to do so. Suppose a man killed another, and someone were to ask, is it all right to kill the killer? I would say yes. But if he asked who has a right to kill him, I would answer, the marshal of guards has a right to kill him. As it is just one Yan marching on another Yan. Why should I have encouraged such a thing? So in his view, Qi is no different from Yan when it comes to his moral depravity. Qi is also morally heavily problematic, but then now Qi annexed Yan. So Mengsha's response points to Qi's apparent confusion. First, between the punitive expedition that Yan deserves and the mere military aggression that is simply unjust. And second, between the fact that Yan deserves a punitive expedition and who is entitled to carry out the punishing. The problem is that Mengsha does not seem to be sure who should assume the role of the heaven-appointed officer in the changed world where there is no institution that presumably, even vicariously, represents the heaven's mandate of heaven, right? So if we talk about somebody who is entitled to carry out this heavenly mission, but then who's going to do that? Because there is no son of heaven who can appoint his delegate. There is no son or heaven institution of heaven that can directly or vicariously represent heaven's will. Then who's going to do this? Qi, or any other state for that matter, may be permitted to punish Yan, a disordered state under a tyrannical government, because Yan deserved heavenly punishment. But who authorizes Qi's punishing, and on what basis is Qi's punishing justified? From the perspective of the old worldview centered on Zhou's universal kingship, to which Mengsha occasionally appears, Qi or any other feudal state has no authority to punish Yan. However well intended its punitive expedition is, because both states are equal in their moral standing vis-a-vis the Zhou court, which had yet to collapse in Mengsha's time. So what is interesting is that while seemingly subscribing to Zhou's global ritualism, Mengsha creates a new source of justification for interstate intervention when he says, it is just one Yan marching on another Yan. Why should I have encouraged such a thing? Well, in the first part, if you look at his answer, in the first part until before as it is, the first part in Mengsha's statement singled out heaven or its delegates as a source of authorization for the punishment of Yan. But the second part, i.e., in other words, Mengsha's conclusion, highlights disqualification of Qi to assume the role of a heaven-appointed officer solely on the basis of its equally inhumane government. So this shift from heaven, or its institutional representative, to Ren. Okay, only so why Qi is not eligible to carry out this heavenly mission? Because Qi is not virtuous. The rule of Qi, you lacks benevolence, the virtue of benevolence, the virtue of the Ren, the virtue. That's why you're not allowed to carry out the heavenly mission. And you did, and that's wrong because you're not allowed to do that. So the focus is now shifted from heaven to virtue of the ruler. Okay, the candidate of this heavenly the mission. So this shift from heaven to virtue in Mencius' political thought is crucially important because Mencius is now opening up a way in which an interstate intervention motivated by humanitarian purposes can be morally justified without positing the existence of an institutional representative of heaven, son of heaven, under normal circumstances, or heaven-appointed officer during a constitutional crisis. Okay? So only here, at this stage, we can talk about humanitarian intervention. It's not, the one state intervenes in another state for the sake of the well-being of the people suffering the tyrannical rule there, but by virtue of the ruler, the intervening ruler's virtue, without any reference to heaven itself. Mencius creates this remarkable innovation in Confucian political theory by reinterpreting Ren, the benevolence, whatever, as originating from heavenly grace, which can reach the people in mediation of a universal king's virtue to rulers, any rulers, in the disposition and moral character. So here we see the great transformation of the meaning of the. Previously it was a potence or power of one universal king, son of heaven, the Zhou king. Now the virtue has become a person's, or any ruler's moral disposition. So only if the intervening ruler is morally upright, then he is allowed to conduct this heavenly mission. Okay? So that we can achieve still virtuous ruling all under heaven. Okay, and then later, Mencius had this another conversation with the king himself, who attacked and annexed Yan, the king of Qi. So this king of Qi asked Mencius this question. Some advised me against annexing Yan, while others urged me to do so. Now they conquered, but defeated Yan's enemy. But then now king says, well, then some people now urging me to annex Yan further. The occupation of a state of 10,000 chariots by another of equal strength in a matter of 50 days in a feat, which could not have been brought about by human agents alone. So he says, I as a ruler of this size of a country, defeated a country of the same size, of same force, which is extraordinary. It can be done by one man or one human force alone. So that means heaven might have supported me. Okay, so he's manipulating the discourse of heaven's mandate. The very fact that I was successful in defeating Yan is because I got this heaven's mandate. So he was kind of using heaven's mandate in the service of his political maneuver. So what do you think about that? And then Mencius replies like this. If in annexing Yan, you please its people, then annex it. There are examples of men in antiquity following such a course of action. King Wu, again, we're talking about King Wu, was one of them. If in annexing Yan, you antagonize its people, then do not annex it. There were also examples of men in antiquity following such a course. King Wen was one. So he didn't annex the people if people were troubled by this action. When it was a state of 10,000 chariots attacking another equal strength, and your army is met by the people bringing baskets of rice and bottles of drink, what other reason can there be than that people are fleeing from water and fire? So if people are enthusiastically welcoming your conquest and annexation, then what are the reasons that people just trying to avoid the fire and water, the tyrannical rule of the people? So if people welcome you enthusiastically, that's fine. You can even annex it. That's legitimate. Should the water become deeper and fire hotter, they would have no alternative but to turn elsewhere for succor. So, completely sidelining the question of heaven, Mencius' response is exclusively focused on whether by annexing Yan, Qi can please the people of Yan. Whether or not Qi is a heaven-appointed officer is not an issue anymore. as Mencius clearly says that the discourse of heaven can easily be manipulated by a politically ambitious ruler like King Shen, his interlocutor here, in the absence of a formal institution of Son of Heaven to which Zhou rulers had privileged access. Therefore, without denying the foundational importance of a mandate of heaven in the legitimation of interstate warfare, as well as a territorial expansion of a state through annexation, Mencius declares that the welfare of the people of the annexed state is the only visible criterion by which to judge whether or not the annexation was morally justified. Okay, so in the later part of my paper, I'm discussing about the justice in conduct of war, basically by relying on Sunji, and on what ethical basis both Mencius and Sunji were rationalized, lend support to their kind of argument. Basically, I'm relying on their virtue ethics, and then because their existing literature is focusing on. Okay, I'm not going to go. Okay, anyhow, so I'm talking about this ethical justification of these two philosophers give for their argument, their political argument. But then I'm not going to discuss that given considering the time. So let me just conclude what I have discussed so far. So by decoupling Ren, or virtue, from universal political institution representative of heaven, and by redefining Ren, or virtue, as a person, hence any rulers, inner disposition or moral character rather than potency or power attached to the political organ itself, achievable without the mediation of a former agent of heaven, Mencius and Sunji found a way to justify a humanitarian intervention, perhaps even a humanitarian annexation, still rationalized in the traditional Zhou language of punishment of a virtuous ruler in the tyrannical state in a world where there is no longer a visible political agent of heaven. So just to make it clear, again, Mencius and Sunji began their political career and theorization in the context where there were independent sovereign states. And then still as an ardent follower of Confucian way, they were trying to realize Confucian idea of global virtue politics in this tremendous altered political situation by redefining Ren and by decoupling it from the political organ of Zhou kingship, and then without revamping or giving up the traditional discourse of punishment, which was originally intelligible only in the context of a moral hierarchy between suzerain king and the feudal lords. Okay, thank you so much.
Very much, Professor Kim. I'm conscious of the time, so maybe we'll collect a few questions or comments and ask Professor Kim to respond at the very end. Yes, Tony?
In the frame, all my wonderful words have gone for nothing. I should repeat myself over again. The Mencian frame of the larger states having a responsibility for the smaller ones, and the language of compassion and caring, this is grounded in a virtue ethic explicitly, which of course since the Enlightenment and Alistair MacIntyre is out, so we have to go back to pre-Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, to find comparable characters. But I believe, this is a subjective intuition, but I believe that a kindred spirit is in French absolutism of Richelieu, who sees the responsibility of France as the largest power in Europe and the most fortunately situated, to accept the responsibility to protect. This is how the French see it. It's not how the Germans used to see it in the 19th and 20th century. That has a responsibility then to protect the smaller states against the tyranny of the Habsburg, all based in a kind of virtue ethic, all based on a notion of heavenly responsibility. And this makes me hugely enthusiastic for commensurability rather than incommensurability of culture. So I have already said that I'm very enthusiastic about your paper and your ideas. But I think the question there, which would have been lost because I didn't have my mouth in the microphone, the question is that this Confucianism, Mencianism that you are describing is much more vigorous, if not aggressive and decisive, than the Mencian, the Confucian ethic that seems to have been the ethos of the late Qing. And I wonder if there's any kind of historical comment you could make on that. The failure of a Confucian ethic in connection with Ryukyu and with, also with France and with Japan, which did very much to discredit Confucianism under the Marxists and at the post May the 4th, that really Confucianism was what debilitated and weakened China, you know.
Thank you. I'll collect one or two more questions and comments before we... this is the final chance for you to raise any question or comment. Yes?
Professor Kim, thank you very much for the enlightening presentation on Mencius. I came across this book by Chesterman. Okay, he's of course a modern writer, writing on the area of humanitarian intervention, and of course, Chesterman. So, in a sense, there is a sort of a mirroring, in a sense that, to a certain extent, okay, the Chinese were way ahead as far as the international humanitarian intervention is concerned, if we were to base it on this warring tribe period. So, if Mencius were alive today, okay, would he still support that international humanitarian intervention?
Thank you. Is there any last question or comment? If not, I'll invite Professor Kim to respond generally. It's difficult questions.
Why Mencius is popular, especially in this subject, the answer is quite easy because Mencius is the only ancient Chinese philosopher who were making explicit comment on this type of issue of war. Even Sun Tzu is very understands maybe perhaps more realistic when it comes to his political theory, but then he discussed about certain aspects about warfare, how to conduct war in a righteous, just manner, but he didn't engage pretty much with this whole issue. But then Mencius, everybody who's familiar with the text of Mencius provides us with ample, discussion, ample resources with which you can engage, right? So in that regard, Mencius is popular. And then Mencius' idea is not, and then going back to your second question, this vigor of Confucianism. Normally Confucianism was, it was about virtue, it was about benevolence, it was about ethics. It's not mainly about politics or this vigor, where does this type of vigor come from? That's why I think there's attraction in Mencius political theory, because on the one hand, I mean, if you just focus on Mencius teaching on moral self-cultivation and moral psychology, it's mainly about, you know, how to become good and how to can help others better. I mean, that kind of thing, which is a very, in some sense, idealistic from political perspective. But if you look at his political theory, almost independently from his moral theory, there's ample resources to derive interesting realistic insights from. So I think what's interesting, I mean, I'm not fully agreeing with Mencius political theory, but what's interesting about Mencius theory is that even if he underpins his theory on virtue ethics, which is very idealistic in some sense, but then he has this realist teeth of theory of his virtue ethics, right? So he's fully aware of this discrepancy between small and weak countries and strong and big countries, and the role and responsible big country. Again, from small country perspective, it might be seen overbearing, and you know, but again, still, you know, because he was living in one of the most turbulent period of human histories, and he was not naive enough to say that, well, only if a king is virtuous and everything is going to be fine. That's most people, especially Songming, a neo-Confucian, understood Mencius in that way. Only if a king cultivates himself to become, you know, sage-like, then everything's going to be fine. But then, if you look at Mencius, read Mencius carefully, but then actually Mencius has a much realistic, you know, advice to offer. So in this regard, it's interesting mix up. You know, he's idealism on the one end, he's kind of realism on the other end. Unlike a legalist broke up this whole chain, shackle of virtue politics, virtue ethics, and virtue discourse. Of they want to just get rid of virtue, and then they want to jump into this pure aspect of dimension of pure power. But then Mencius was trying to balance between these two things. How whether he was successful, of course, depends on how we interpret his theory. But then I think that's important question. What if Mencius is alive now? How are you going to advise us? I don't know. I mean, I mean, going back to all today's presentation, still, I mean, this makes sense. This whole thing makes sense only if we, I mean, even if Mencius is trying to revamp Confucianism, I mean, reconstruct Confucianism in a way that is, in a way, relevant to warring state period, but still, I mean, the word punishment is very, you know, problematic word in current, you know, political situation. So unless we suppose or posit certain moral hierarchy of among the states, and in Mencius' case, this moral hierarchy is still undergirded by rituals. Again, or remnants of rituals. He's using ritual language. See, once you adopt the language of law and rights, it's going to be impossibly difficult to make sense of and justify this type of discourse, because this type of discourse is possible only when we think, when we approach the world in heavily moral terms and seeing the world as if the world is hierarchically ordered. And Mencius still, even if he's dealing with this 7 or 8 almost equal states politically speaking, but then still he's kind of recreating this moral order, right, by still adopting the language of punishment and hierarchical language. So I think that's the question. I mean, you know, we cannot reintroduce the tributary system here, but still there is certain attraction in traditional Chinese discourse of international interstate relationship. But then how can we maybe you know, glean or get some, I mean, drive certain attractive parts of this older to ancient discourse in a way that can address or redress certain problems that we are currently dealing with. I think there is some room, I mean, rituals and relationship, treating others as brothers and sisters, and, you know, some mildly, you know, recognizable or understood the relationship like Tibet and Han people. That's the discourse that Chinese government is using. You know, liberal multiculturalism doesn't work here. We're going to treat you as if you are our younger brother, and then we're going to act as if you're elder brother. So we're going to provide for you, and then in return, you're going to show us respect. And then without embroiling ourselves in this liberal rights discourse, we can still maintain this harmony of the state. I mean, that kind of discourse can be, I think, reproduced in certain level in certain area, but still, again, wholesale embracement, wholesale reproduction is going to be, I think, impossible. So we need to think more. I mean, theory, that's the role of theorists. How can we do this? I mean, in a way that makes sense in a contemporary political situation.
Thank you. So maybe with that, we will close this session. And last but not least, we'll invite Professor Karti to give some closing remarks, or Professor Nyman, since the two of you are the organizers.
Does this work? No? So I will keep them brief because we are moving to catch the bus and so on. I would like to very much extend my thanks to a large number of people, especially to basically to everybody. I would like to thank Raymond and Joyce and Sharif, who has left, for their wonderful logistic organization of this whole event, which has moved effortlessly. And I would like to thank Susan and Jan and Ahe and Christoph, and I hope we don't miss anyone out, Sung Moon, and the Yiping and the scholars who have come from near and far to support this event here, and especially my friend Albert, who well beyond the call of duty has spent 2 days with us on Friday and Saturday listening to virtually every session, and that means a great deal to me, and I'm very grateful for Albert's presence. And I would like to thank my research assistants and research students for their wonderful participation, which I am so delighted has been so well appreciated by all of you, whether they are undergraduates or whether they are research assistants or whether they are finishing PhD students. They have done wonderful work on our project. And I would like especially to thank my colleague and my friend Jan, who has been long suffering on this project that we are working on together now for several years, and for the stimulation of her challenge to Richard Tuck and the problematization of the dominant approaches to international law, but also offering a positive alternative vision in the Northern European Renaissance, and the whole idea of trying to connect that with some revival of essentially pre-modern virtue-based East Asian philosophical thinking, which doesn't have to be, as Sungmun shows so clearly, identified completely with China. It's an East Asian way of thinking. And so for me, as I now come to the last days of my time in Hong Kong, I want to just thank you all again for what for me has been a wonderful 2 days. And it will be recorded for all posterity by Raymond and his colleagues in a DVD, which will cost at least 500 euros a copy.
Tony, you're starting a business of our... I'm not going to repeat all the words of thanks that have just been spoken, and I only can share in them. Thank you so much for all your insightful comments and questions, and the way you participated during these past 2 days. Thank you so much to all those who have written papers and contributed, or contributed by chairing. It's been a very, very good 2 days. I will only extend my gratitude personally, not only institutionally, but personally, to Tony for these days and for the collaboration on this project, which has always been, and I'm sure will continue to be, very stimulating, and we'll have a lot of work to do to bring it all together. So we're not done yet. I think we both realize that very much. But thanks also to the university and the faculty for hosting us. So I look forward to a relaxing dinner. I hope you do too. Okay, thank you all. Sorry? taxation.